Well, hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Craig Hamilton. As you know, we'll be talking about illustrious themes, I think, the themes of sacred and meaning and really a sort of reflection of his in-depth concerns. So I think practically all of you, maybe all, will already be aware of Craig and his work. And so he doesn't really need a big introduction, and neither he nor I like great, long, ponderous introductions. So let me just say that Britain was very fortunate to become the country where Craig emigrated to, or immigrated into, a long time ago, and has then pursued his interest and love of classical architecture and then the practice of it from his base near the border of England and Wales, and not too near, but not too distant from the smoky metropolis of London. And from there, he's been just conducting some wonderful projects, which have, I think, culminated in the project at Dallas that we're going to see tonight. And that will be really a treat and something pretty special. So otherwise, I just a sort of little connection, because I've been reading Ellis Woodman's introduction to the book Temples and Tombs, which you should all get if you haven't already. And Ellis makes some great pertinent points there. And I came across this reference to Craig going out to see Geoffrey Barwell, where in fact I worked there for a little bit. I can't claim to have designed major projects there. So there's a little connection that sometimes in these events, crops up. And then the other thing to note was, I think, Ellis's closing statement, that really he put Craig in the company of two very eminent British architects or architectural practices, that to say David Chipperfield, and then the practice of Caruso St. John, of Adam Caruso and Peter St. John, and as sort of, forces of intellect and artistry of a comparable level, and was in effect urging the wider audience of non-traditionalists and non-classicists to take Craig and work of this caliber seriously. So on that note, I would just like to hand over to Craig, and I as sure everyone else is agog to hear what he has to say. So
thank you. Thank you, Mark, for your very kind words of introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The title of this talk, The House of the Statue That Fell from Heaven, refers, of course, to the wooden statue of Athene in the Erechtheum on the Acropolis in Athens, that was so precious to the Athenians and which they believed miraculously fell from heaven. An object that was venerated for its ability to protect the citizens of Athens from the horrors of the world. It is known as the Athenaeum Palladium and is one of many examples from antiquity of precious statues of deities housed within beautiful buildings. A building which has no function at all other than to house a deity. That very precious idea of redundant beauty that is so incredibly rare to find in buildings of modern day times. This poetic idea has haunted me for almost all my life as an architect. Over the years, I have been truly blessed in being able, in one form or another, to produce buildings where that poetic idea is central to the design, thanks largely to my enduring collaboration and friendship with the greatest living neoclassical sculptor genius, Alexander Stoddart, sculptor in ordinary to His Majesty King Charles III. As the pattern of these buildings emerged over the years, I have come to realize that perhaps one of the main purposes of my life is to be a maker of houses that contain the statues that fall from heaven, and to offer my services as an architect to the deity of art, in the growing knowledge, the older that I get, that there is very little in life that has more redeeming power than art, and that there is no more powerful anesthetic to the horrors of the modern utilitarian world than an immersion in the world of art. The images that follow are of buildings realized and unrealized, and of the work of dead heroes, architects, and artists that have embraced this idea and shone a bright light in an otherwise dark world on the statues that have metaphorically fallen from heaven. Here we have the Erectium, rather marvelously reconstructed by Theodore Ballou in the mid-19th century, with the figure of Athena Minerva Poliard at the center of the temple, a fanciful reconstruction, perhaps more Roman than Greek, but poignant nevertheless in its representation of the idea of a temple built with the sole purpose of housing a deity. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you.
It's stuck.
From Athens, we are transported to the beautiful Athens of the far north, Copenhagen, a city of sublime, chaste beauty, at the center of which is placed an extraordinary polychrome temple, which sits by the canal side like a beautiful colored flower. This is, of course, the Thorvaldsen Museum. Notice how it rather miraculously borrows the dome of the Royal Church beyond, a fine neoclassical building by C.F. Hansen, who incidentally was not at all amused that a young architect by the name of Michael Gottlieb Bindesbøll had visually appropriated his dome to float miraculously above this new exotic temple. Next slide. Bindesbøll's monumental entrance facade of extraordinary simplicity, power, and invention. It is at once familiar and fresh. We recognize the sources from Egypt and Greece and subtle transformation into a temple, a museum, and a mausoleum, because this building houses not only the art of the great neoclassical sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen, but also his mortal remains. The canal side elevation is perhaps even more remarkable, with a painted classical frieze just above the plinth. The panel on the extreme right is of particular significance. For here, we have a depiction by the Danish Golden Age painter Jørgen Zorn of the arrival of Thorvaldsen in Copenhagen in 1844, back from Rome, where he produced most of his wonderful work through all his life as a sculptor. We must remember that this man, who some of you might have heard of or might not have heard of, was the most famous artist in the entire world at the time. And he had come home after many years and brought with him, as a donation to his city of birth, the remains of his vast output of sculpture to be housed in a newly built museum. This panel poignantly depicts the very moment that he sets his foot on Danish soil and is met by his many admirers. A close-up of the white-haired Thorvaldsen being greeted by his protege, sculptor, the genius sculptor Hermann Ernest Freund. Do please remember that name because it will come up again a little later in this talk. On the left is Thorvaldsen's self-portrait standing with a figure of a deity. And on the right, the architect Michael Gottlieb Bindesbøll, who holds in his left hand his plans for the Thorvaldsen Museum. Does he not look like the most agreeable man? Who cannot be enchanted by his benign and humble expression, and one can tell from the wonderful waistcoat that he wears that here is a man also of considerable panache as well. Thorvaldsen and Bindesbøll, sculptor and architect who worked in close and delightful collaboration. the younger Bindesbøll devoting a large proportion of his life to building a temple to house the statues of Thorvaldsen. He produced a few other buildings, but it can be argued, I think, that his most important purpose in life was to produce the Thorvaldsen Museum, a building to house the work of Thorvaldsen and a building undoubtedly in service of art. Next slide. Here we have the central courtyard within the museum with Thorvaldsen's grave at its very center. Note how the painted decorations show putti driving chariots along the journey of life around the perimeter of the courtyard, chasing around the meta post between life and death. Notice also, again, Bindesbøll's mischievous borrowing of poor C.F. Hansen's adjoining dome, a case of architectural theft, but put so mischievously and miraculously to use, floating over the grave of the artist. Next slide. From Copenhagen, we travel back in time and south to Rome, where Thorvaldsen and Bindesbøll were part of a group of Danish Golden Age artists of genius, all happily enjoying the luxury of their company in the eternal city where Thorvaldsen had his studio for so many decades. This is a group portrait of the Danish group. Their master Thorvaldsen is absent, but I wonder if you can all guess which is our man Bindesbøll. Yes, you will have guessed that he is in the immediate foreground, hooker in hand and with a fez, a bright red fez on his head. How could we miss him? And propped up on his drawing board to the right are his designs for the Thorvaldsen Museum. What a friendly and convivial image, made even more so by their canine friend perched so nonchalantly on the chair. And this is the same group, more or less, again in a taverna in Rome. Thorvaldsen is immediately identifiable in the foreground with his shock of beautiful white hair, elegant waistcoat and slippers. Bindesbøll sits opposite him, giving the order to the waiter. They sit amongst locals, and in the background, an avuncular proprietor places a pizza in the oven. One cannot think of a more convivial arrangement, and this is the atmosphere in which great art is perhaps best nurtured. These images painted by members of the group illustrate such a vivid picture for us of a group entirely devoted to art. Back again in Copenhagen, we are in front of the other long side of the Thorvaldsen Museum, and it too has a painted frieze above the plinth. This frieze shows the Thorvaldsen works being hauled into the museum on a ramp, and to the left, our man Bindesbøll stands by the entrance to welcome and shepherd the statues to the interior. Next slide, Gail, can we manage? This so reminds me of the very many moments when I have stood, like Bindesbøll shown here, at the entrance to one of my almost completed buildings, awaiting the entry of the statue, worrying that it might just not quite fit perfectly or that it might be damaged, and always in huge anticipation. Next slide. The magnificent entrance hall with its patterned floor and coffered ceiling and Thorvaldsen's plaster casts. Each room on the interior has a different decorative ceiling painted by some of the most famous Danish Golden Age painters, and indeed some that were shown in those wonderful paintings of the group when they were all together later in the Royal Academy in Copenhagen. So they came back from Rome and they decorated this building collectively. And it is poignant that those Danish Golden Age painters are represented in the painting gallery on the first floor, and the room is furnished with furniture they designed themselves as artists, for these were artists who sculpted, painted, and designed furniture, all inspired by Pompeii and Herculaneum. In the foreground is a table and chairs by Hermann Ernest Freund, the gentleman we saw previously meeting Thorvaldsen as he arrived. And please remember this table and chairs because it's going to make another cameo appearance towards the end of this talk. The interior of the museum also contains rooms devoted to Thorvaldsen's collections of antiquity. And collecting was another passion for Thorvaldsen, and like Sohn, these collected objects provided endless inspiration. Perhaps the most important room of all in the interior is the Christ room, which has the plaster cast of Christ and the 12 apostles, as well as the kneeling angel holding a shell as a font executed by Thorvaldsen for the cathedral in Copenhagen, the Forfrøkirke, designed by C.F. Hansen. Here we have the deity in the temple. Notice the barrel-vaulted ceiling which derives from the baths in Herculaneum. 6 of the apostles. This austere and chaste temple is the Forfrøkirke in Copenhagen, with its Doric portico and its bronze frieze in the pediment by Thorvaldsen of St. John the Baptist. This building and its sculptural program was the direct reference for my new chapel at Culham, and I would ask you to hold these images in your mind's eye until we come to the slides of Culham. The breathtaking interior where the focus is the beautiful edicule at the east end, which contains Thorvaldsen's famous standing figure of Christ. The reference to deities in Greek temples is so striking and poignant, especially as this is a Christian temple, demonstrating the way in which the idea of a temple to house a statue can transcend both time and religion. The figure in its edicule. Notice how Christ very unusually appears to be quietly stepping backwards, accompanied by the words on the plinth, "Komme til mig," come with me. The exquisite refinement of an idealized neoclassical face. And the view of the sanctuary looking west with the back of the kneeling angel font in the foreground and the 12 apostles between arches either side of the nave. And the apostles seen above the pews. One of the beautiful marble apostles. Notice how the lines of the drapery seem to be so redolent of the adjoining Doric architecture. Sculpture and architecture in perfect accord. Back inside the Thorvaldsen Museum, a photo of Alexander Stoddart alongside Thorvaldsen's self-portrait. Stoddart is, as I said before, our greatest living neoclassical sculptor and a genius as great as Thorvaldsen, in my opinion. Over the years, Sandy and I have collaborated on so many projects, realized and unrealized, so much so that I've come to see myself as something of an equivalent to what Bindesbøll was to Thorvaldsen. On the left, C.W. Eckersberg, who was the father of the Danish Golden Age Painting Academy. His painting of Thorvaldsen as a young sculptor in Rome. And on the right, a very small, modest portrait that I made of Sandy for his 50th birthday. Sandy and I had long dreamed of somehow, somewhere, creating a temple dedicated to a deity in the manner of the temple of Zeus, shown here with its ivory-covered statue of Zeus by the great sculptor Phidias at Olympia. We never quite believed that it might ever happen, and yet miraculously it did. In a small temple on the mount beside the River Thames in Berkshire, the Chapel of Christ the Redeemer at Culham, thanks to very extraordinary patronage. The west entrance will immediately remind you in a modest way of Hansen's Cathedral of Our Lady in Copenhagen, chaste in manner and immediately recognizable as a temple devoted to deities. Two bronze statues by Stoddart stand against the monumental pilaster panels that form the portico, and set within the back wall of the portico at high level above the bronze doors is a long horizontal recess that will house a frieze by Sandy of the Sermon on the Mount. Unlike the Forvrøkirke in Copenhagen, the frieze is not within the tympanum of the pediment, but inside the portico instead. Nevertheless, the reference to the Thorvaldsen frieze is very clear. Saint Cecilia on the left, patron saint of music, immediately identifiable by her hand organ, and on the right, Saint Sabina. Here we see Sandy's sketches for the frieze of the Sermon on the Mount, which will be realized in Portland stone that will adorn the portico, and below the final plaster models nearing completion. Notice the reference in particular to Thorvaldsen's standing figure of Christ with his outspread arms. By autumn this year, the frieze will at last be in place, completing the exterior some 8 years after the building was consecrated. Sculpture takes considerably longer to produce than buildings, and where sculpture is so fundamental to architecture, such as this, it takes years for the whole composition to be completed. This is indeed what we might call slow architecture. On opening the bronze doors, this is the very first glimpse of the interior, with Alexander Stoddart's seated figure of Christ the Redeemer, the very focus of the building at the point of entry. I have such a vivid memory of guiding Sandy into the building in complete silence for the first time to see his great figure in place and our mutual dream realized. The view from the nave, where the 5 recessed niches either side are clearly visible, awaiting the statues of the remaining 10 apostles, which will arrive in the years to come, and God willing, I might live long enough to see it. You will, of course, see the homage paid to Hansen's great cathedral in Copenhagen and to Thorvaldsen's sculptural program there. The sanctuary is now complete with all sculpture in place. St. John and St. Peter flanking the altar and the seated figure of Christ, creating a simple pyramidal composition. Architectural homage, of course, is also being paid to Michelangelo's Medici Chapel in Florence. St. John on the left and St. Peter on the right, set within the vast thickness of the chancel arch. An image that perhaps best illustrates the idea of the statue that fell from heaven, with the mosaic dome floating above the statue. The sublime beauty of Alexander Stoddart's statue. Notice how the feet are crossed on top of each other and the left hand touches the side of the torso. These gestures prefigure, of course, the crucifixion. This idea is further enhanced by the horizontal back of the klismos chair on which Christ sits. That is a clear reference to the cross. The view from the sanctuary looking west, the niches either side are shown here, where the remaining 10 apostles will be placed in years to come, and the organ loft is visible immediately above the west door. And a close-up of the niches, the nave niches, awaiting the apostles. The third apostle is currently being made and designed, and here we have Sandy's bozzetto of St. Andrew, shown here as a fisherman of men, when the apostles are all finally in place, probably in 10 years' time, the homage to Thorvaldsen and that glorious cathedral in Copenhagen will finally be complete. The sculptural program at Cullum extends to all other areas of the chapel as well. Here we have the crypt looking towards the crypt altar at the east end. And here looking west toward the pair of solid stone doors at the west end, where Sandy has provided a group of works all related to the entombment of Christ and his resurrection. Iconography, of course, which is eminently befitting of a crypt. The solid stone doors cut out of Irish limestone with Sandy's tympanum over the top. The deep door reveals have two small recesses which contain two bas-reliefs by Alexander Stoddart. These niches are, of course, veiled from view when the doors are opened, an allusion to the ultimate mystery of art. The tympanum with the two shining angels that Mary Magdalene saw when she looked into Christ's empty tomb, cut from the same Ballinasloe limestone as the stone doors. Completing the triumvirate of bas-reliefs are the two door reveal niche reliefs. On the left, St. John and his companion, apostle, looking into the empty tomb. Notice the circular heavy stone door that has been rolled away from the tomb opening. And on the right, the famous Noli me tangere moment, which has been so very often depicted in Western art, where Mary sees the risen Christ and after first mistaking him for a gardener, suddenly recognizes him and he exclaims, "Touch me not, for I am not yet risen." Adjoining the crypt chapel is a small lady chapel devoted to Our Lady and to women in general. It is entered through a screen of gilt bronze set into a Portland stone surround. The Lady Chapel altar with Alexander Stoddart's beautiful, rather unusual, painted bronze statue of the Virgin and Child. Surely this is another statue that has fallen from heaven. The statue and its edicule of gilt timber, everywhere in this particular room, symbols of Our Lady abound. The statue embracing the sweet manner of the Florentine Renaissance school. One thinks of Desiderio da Settignano, for example, and his school of sculptors. Very poignantly, Sandy depicts the moment that the child offers bread to his mother, a reference, of course, to the Eucharist. But Sandy also describes how this gesture illustrates the moment when a child, having chewed on a biscuit, for example, offers the soggy remains to a parent, and in so doing realizes the joy that comes from giving to others. On the north wall of the Lady Chapel, above the entrance door, Sandy has produced another remarkable painted bronze, a bust of Elizabeth, the mother of St. John the Baptist. Elizabeth was beyond childbearing age when she miraculously conceived, and she is therefore represented here as an aged woman. And on the south wall, opposite the bust of Elizabeth, Sandy has produced a large painted bronze bas-relief of the Virgin lying on the lap of her mother, with the young Christ on the left and St. John the Baptist on the right. The imagery refers, of course, to Leonardo da Vinci's wonderful cartoon of the Virgin sat in the lap of her mother that can be seen in the National Gallery in London. But the stroke of genius that Stoddart displays in the prone pose of the Virgin, which prefigures the Pieta, another much represented iconic image in Western art. And so these layered references to great art reveal and disguise themselves in a way which suggests that Cullum Chapel is not only the house of the statue that fell from heaven, but also a house devoted to the deity of art itself in all its mysterious truth. Before we leave the Lady Chapel, if you look up, the coffered and part gilded walnut ceiling with its gilded floral drops represents celestial heaven with all its stars floating over a chapel devoted to Our Lady, Queen of the Heavens. Back up at ground floor is a small baptistry located directly above the Lady Chapel and adjoining the west entrance doors to the main chapel. Here we have the baptistry altar with a triptych of St. John, with the angel Gabriel on the left, approaching St. John's father on the right, the priest Zachariah, who is incensing the altar and who is struck dumb by the news that Gabriel brings, that his wife Elizabeth is to bear a child after so many years of having been barren. The striking dumb is also a symbol of the way in which great art can leave one speechless and wonderfully anesthetized against the horrors of the noisy, word-centered world that we inhabit. The final image from Cullum, Sandy's very poignant image of a seated angel holding a shell as the font, a very obvious homage to Thorvaldsen's kneeling angel in the cathedral in Copenhagen. From Cullum, we move to a secular temple, a bathhouse in Gloucestershire set in the grounds of an 18th century house. This is a temple to pleasure and is presided over by Aphrodite, depicted in the central panel of the frieze by Alexander Stoddart over the entrance door, shown arriving on the island of Paphos and being clothed by her attendants. Either side of the central panel are panels depicting the successive dynasties of sea gods and goddesses through the Greek period into the Roman period. As a building dedicated to Aphrodite, this sets the narrative for the interior where all her attributes and aspects from her legends were incorporated into interior fittings. And now to the first of two mausoleums that we designed and had built that are both very good examples of buildings that were designed with the central idea of housing a deity of sorts. In this first mausoleum, one enters the temenos, or sacred area, through a pair of monumental pylons, which frame a bas-relief by Alexander Stoddart. Two of the three graces stand either side of a central draped vase. The entrance to the interior of the mausoleum is on the opposite side to the entrance into the temenos enclosure, and placed centrally within the dark opening is the missing third grace, an allegory of remembrance in bronze looking into the dark interior. Her beautiful robed back displays a subtle reference to the flutings of a column. She turns her back on the bright sunlight of our world of suffering, and looks into the world of the dead. She is not with us, she is with the dead. From the interior, the statue is seen contre jour, against the light, lending it a wonderfully mysterious quality. In her one hand, she holds the lamp that symbolizes the act of remembrance, which throws a gentle, flickering light on the mysterious dark territory of memory. And in the other, she holds an asphodel, picked from the flowering fields of Elysium. This building is an example of where the idea of placing the statue was the kernel of the design from the very outset. Yet another example of the genius of Alexander Stoddart. The next and second mausoleum is in the forecourt of the West Cemetery at Highgate Cemetery, where it faces the War Memorial and is flanked by the Gothic chapel. Bronze doors with bunches of pomegranates are flanked by a pair of abstracted columns with funerary urns as capitals, draped with the stiff or frozen cloth motif that runs through much of my work. The interior has as its focus Sandy's magnificent marble statue of a seated angel that guards over the centrally placed sarcophagus. Set against a dark red porphyry-like niche, it symbolically occupies the threshold between this world and the next. Arching above the interior is an unusual coffered structural stone vault, redolent of a barrel vault open-air bower, grown over with abstracted vegetation, carved in stone. This statue surely also metaphorically fell from heaven. The prosaic truth, however, is that the installation of this fragile marble statue with its delicate one hand stretching out in benediction was almost impossibly difficult to lift into place, into the niche over the already installed sarcophagus. On the side walls, either side of the angel, are two bronze reliefs by Alexander Stoddart, set within stone edicules and flanked by panels hung with drapes carved in Portland stone. On the left, an allegory of faith, and on the right, an allegory of fortitude. To complete our tour of mausoleums, I have two images of an unrealized mausoleum, also for Highgate Cemetery. Two monumental Portland blocks face each other across an enclosed courtyard that is cut into a bank. Inside the courtyard, looking towards the open mausoleum with its centrally placed statue again, a reworking of the earlier mausoleum. Sadly, this mausoleum was not to be realized. A quick look at two further unrealized projects where sculpture has been so central to the architecture, although in these cases where the sculpture was to be placed within newly designed squares between buildings. Here is a new town square in Penrith in Cumbria, a border town known historically for its cattle markets, where cattle were traded between Scotland and England. Here, Sandy produced a wonderful statue of a great bull being led by dancing Vestal virgins, which might have stood within a courtyard of buildings that paid homage to Schinkel and Plechnik. And here, what might have been at the University of the West of Scotland, in that great Greek city, Paisley, where Sandy has his studio. We were asked to provide a master plan for the university and suggested a great court with monumental buildings adjoining the street frontage, opposite the miraculous Coates Memorial Church, which you can see in the foreground. Placed between the two new buildings is a statue of the truly great Paisley-born architect Thomas Smith Tate, who designed so many masterpieces in the early 20th century, including St. Andrew's House in Edinburgh, and famously the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Sadly, this scheme was not to be, and Sandy and I had to look west to America, to the New World, to see our dreams on an urban scale realized. Dallas, Texas, a green oasis in the Oak Lawn area of the city where Sandy and I have been working for an extraordinary patron since 2017. Our campanile, or bell tower, dominates the photo and stands as a beacon of civilization in this modern city. And just to its right, our second project can be seen with its long temple facade, and behind that, the connected, inverted commas, palazzo. The bell tower is a building which has no other purpose at all than to house a new bell, Horatio, of Big Ben proportions, and on the ground floor, a deity, Tyche, or Fortuna in Roman terms, holding in her arms the young god Kairos, the Greek god of opportunity. Fortune holding opportunity in her arms. The temple and palazzo seen behind provide office space, with the upper floor housing the private offices of ex-President George W. Bush. This building also has a remarkable sculptural program by Alexander Stoddart, To the right and just out of this picture is an entire city square where we have designed the eastern extension to this private campus of office buildings. Let's begin with the new offices, now known as Freedom Place, seen here from Maple Avenue street frontage, the temple form to the left and the palazzo form to the right. A frontal view of the palazzo portion of the development, constructed of handmade brick and Indiana limestone tied to a steel frame. The sculpture program, however, is evident on the opposite facade where an enclosed courtyard has been created. A monumental brick and stone arch announces the entrance to the entrance courtyard. Framed within the arch is Alexander Stoddart's epic scale, heroic scale bronze statue of the angel of the categorical imperative, more commonly now known as the Spirit of Duty. This is the primary view of the statue, seen against the backdrop of the heavily modulated facade of the palazzo-like part of the building. The 16-foot-high statue stands on a tall granite pedestal with a great gilded disc set into the front. That disc perhaps says something about the mystery of art. This figure stands a little like the giant figure of Athena Minerva might once have stood in front of the Parthenon on the Acropolis, greeting the arrival of pilgrims and directing them to the entrance of the temple. It also makes very subtle reference, of course, to the Statue of Liberty in New York, a work which Sandy holds in great regard. The temple front with its double pile portico to provide deep shade in the Texan sun to the building entrance. The entry door is tucked into the side of this portico, a Renaissance-inspired doorway with its Texan-inspired cow and corn cob frieze, a subtle reference to the work of the great American architectural sculptor Lee Lowry. And under the portico is a bronze frieze by Alexander Stoddart that depicts the story of the Roman senator Cincinnatus, who gave his name to the city of Cincinnatus. Here, the senator, who has retired to his farm, is approached by the Roman Senate to save Rome once more from peril. Reluctantly, Cincinnatus returns to Rome to serve as a dictator and marshals the troops. And in the final panel, having saved Rome, the reluctant ruler returns to his plow just as quickly as he can. Oh, how wonderful it might be if we had more reluctant rulers who wanted only to return to their rural quiet idyls just as soon as they possibly could. This story, together with the Spirit of Duty statue, express the narrative of self-sacrifice that is a theme to which these buildings are dedicated. I thought you might enjoy seeing the development of the designs for the Spirit of Duty with the initial small maquette on the left and the larger model on the right. And the great scale of the figure is shown in this photo in Sandy's studio. This surely too must qualify, I think, as a statue that has fallen from heaven. The bell tower or campanile, as seen at dawn from a large square in front of it on the west campus of the old Parkland development. Overall, it measures about 230 feet high and again is constructed of handmade brick and limestone, this time tied to a concrete frame. The upper reaches of the campanile and the lower two orders of the building. These orders are both, at both levels, are a very subtle invention based on the Corinthian proportions, but with bighorn sheep and bison capitals, and also the Manor stone drapes that drop like honor cloths as seen in Renaissance paintings by Venetian masters such as Giovanni Bellini, for example. However, the focus of this elevation, indeed of the whole building, is Sandy's monumental marble figure of Tyche, the Greek goddess Tyche, or in Roman terms, Fortuna, framed by the central arch, which is repeated on all four facades. Notice also the two currently uninhabited granite plinths which flank the archway. These await Sandy's bronze-seated figures of Aristotle and Adam Smith. The interior, where the statue of Tyche stands on a granite pedestal which emerges through an aperture in the floor from the crypt below. And surrounding the figure are four first-floor niches, each with limestone statues by Alexander Stoddart. Tyche, holding the god Kairos, or opportunity, represents the opportunity that America has offered to its citizens. And the four accompanying figures are known as the four endeavors, each depicting a century and a form of endeavor. The architecture, of course, again pays homage to Michelangelo, whose influence hovers over me perpetually. Here we see Tyche holding a cornucopia in her right arm, and in her left, Kairos with his distinctive forelock of hair on the front and bare head at the back. Surely this too must be a statue that has fallen from heaven. It certainly felt like that to Sandy and I as we looked in amazement that this had been realized in the 21st century. The development studies for the Tyche statue. At the first endeavor, the stonemason. Notice in the realized final version, the bison head capital, another homage to Lee Lowry, the sculptor who collaborated so marvelously with Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue, one of America's greatest architects of the early 20th century. The second endeavor, the merchant with his fleece, a very subtle reference to Jason's fleece and to a statue that Thorvaldsen made for Thomas Hope, actually, and that is housed in the entrance stairway of the Thorvaldsen Museum. And the third endeavor, a farmer digging into the earth and praying that something might grow by looking up. The fourth and final endeavor, the modest and very poignant image of a young woman as an educator. Now we should pay a quick visit to the crypt or lower chamber of the bell tower. The entrance is shown here, all hewn out of granite. And here, a view looking up the shaft of the Tyche pedestal through the upper chamber to the dome above. Before we leave the campanile, we should return to the principal facade, seen here in a terracotta study made by Sandy with the two seated statues that are currently being made in the Paisley studio. The maquettes for Aristotle on the left and Adam Smith on the right. As with Cullum Chapel, we must be patient and wait for these figures to arrive and complete the architectural composition for posterity to enjoy. The third and final project of the trilogy in Dallas is currently being constructed. It is known as the East Campus and is shown here, three connected structures occupying the corner of the site and with the central tallest block, acknowledging the very strong diagonal link between this site and the present West Campus. As the focus to this heavily planted courtyard is a significant statue by Alexander Stoddart, which was envisaged from the very outset. The street entry view of the group of buildings and the Maple Street elevation shows the complex. And if you look carefully, you can see Sandy's statue rising in the center, where the three graces in bronze holding up a globe can readily be seen. two of the studies for the 36-foot high statue, which combines granite with bronze. The statue is an allegory of the Greek term eudaimonia that describes a state or condition of happiness or well-being. Aristotle described the term as representing the highest form of human good. And the three female figures holding the single globe are supported around the pedestal by four groups of figures which represent faith, family, friends, and vocation, work, groups that can support the state of eudaimonia. Two of the bozzettos for the groupings around the base of the statue. We hope very much that the buildings will be complete at the end of next year and that the statue might be installed a year or so later. And finally, from Dallas, I would like to transport you to our home here in rural Radnorshire, a modest group of limewash buildings set within a small ancient hill farm that my wife and I have nurtured over the past 30 years. For this has been regarded as a temenos of sorts, within which temples have arisen that are dedicated to art. My wife, the painter Diana Holton, is depicted here in a painting by me that is a love letter of sorts to her and to our pastoral idyll. Diana is placed on a throne-like chair, which I designed years ago, which has versions of the Kerameikos bull from Athens in bronze, supporting the arms of the chair. She is placed against a beautiful red honor cloth of the type so often used by Giovanni Bellini, the Renaissance Venetian painter, and is flanked by two of her beloved Welsh white cows that she cares for each day. Surrounding her is a view from high ground on our farm, a landscape that she has nurtured in the most remarkable way over so many years. On the extreme left is a small sprite-like figure, naked sprite-like figure, dancing on the back of a donkey. In fact, a donkey derived from Bellini's famous painting of St. Francis of Assisi, which is now in the Frick collection in New York. This figure, I suppose, is an allegory of art, the deity that presides over all that we try to do here at Coed Mawr. The figure is dancing naked, even in the cold, snowy landscape of the heart of winter, because art presents a mysterious, courageous truth that is so often in contrast with the pedestrian world that confronts us day to day. Here at Coed Mawr, we built an extension almost 2 decades ago, and you will, of course, immediately recognize the influence of Bindesbøll's Thorvaldsen Museum in this simple building with its rhythm of tapered doors. So in a way, I've tried to bring you full circle. Statues occupy the walled garden in front of the south facade. Museum copies of bronzes from Herculaneum and Pompeii, the two famous deer, and the figures of the goddess Diana on the left and her brother Apollo on the right. On the interior, there are rooms devoted to art. The entrance lobby is shown here with plaster casts of Thorvaldsen's Ganymede and a relief within the plinth from Copenhagen's cathedral. On the left are Alexander Stoddart's Stations of the Cross from my first chapel in Scotland, and alongside Schinkel's reliefs from the demolished Bauer Academy in Berlin. On the opposite wall, a plaster cast of Sandy's Two Graces from the first mausoleum that we designed together. The sitting room is a repository of the art that we have collected and made ourselves. On the left are Diana's lovely landscape paintings, and elsewhere bronze maquettes by Sandy abound alongside Danish Golden Age statuary and paintings. The furniture includes a small collection of Danish Golden Age furniture designed by artists for themselves that I described earlier in this talk. In the foreground is the famous Pompeian inspired table designed by H.E. Freund that we first saw earlier in the painting gallery in the Thorvaldsen Museum. The mantel shelf with bronze busts by Alexander Stoddart. and a window reveal with Danish Golden Age paintings of C.W. Eckersberg, Constantine Hansen, and in the middle, a view of the courtyard of the mausoleum with Thorvaldsen's grave. The small drawing at the bottom, which you can barely see, is a drawing of Thorvaldsen's self-portrait statue. And a wall of Danish Golden Age paintings and drawings, and Michael Gottlieb Bindesbøll's Pompeian-inspired sofa placed below a small portrait of Hermann Ernest Freund. On the left, Sandy's crowning angel. And so the interior is indeed a house that was designed to house all the mysteries of art that have metaphorically fallen from heaven. Outside, beyond the house, is a stoa overlooking a pond and pergola set in an Arcadian landscape populated with memorials to the great artists, architects, and mentors that have inspired us. A view on axis with the house looking through the stoa or loggia at the south facade of the house. And opposite that view and on the central axis of the house is a bronze copy of Thorvaldsen's statue of Venus Triumphant, placed on a very tall pedestal so that she is elevated above the woodland and the surrounding house and landscape. She is the focus of all the world that we inhabit, Venus, the goddess of beauty, holding the golden apple. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you, Craig. That was magnificent. Absolutely spectacular, thoughtful, inspiring review of your work and the amazing continuity that goes through it, and this continuity particular through the work of Sandy Stoddart. So I've, while other people are coming up with questions, and we can look at chats in a moment, maybe if Victoria or Simon can sort of monitor the chats. Since it is such a personal connection, I was wondering if you allow me a couple of questions, and I have also a comment.
Sure.
Just how you met Sandy and how it all started. I think it would be nice to have a little biographical detail.
Yes. Well, I'm embarrassed to say that all my life I've been, a reluctant architect, really, I suppose. And I've led a sort of double life wanting to be an artist. And early in my career, at a low moment, I thought I might be a sculptor. I realized very, very quickly that I had very inadequate skills. And I knew of Sandy. I knew I knew of his reputation. I'd not met him, and I received my first commission for my first chapel, and I realized that I needed to contact him. So I phoned him. He had just returned from New York, and we had the most extraordinary conversation on the telephone. And that was many, many years ago, and it led on from there, really. And it's been sort of one of the greatest blessings of my life, really, because it's transformed everything that I've ever done in architecture. And I genuinely believe that, one of my primary roles in life is to provide the architecture for his work.
Amazing. Well, no, that's good. So lovely to hear that. And then on a sort of personal comment, I don't know if it's information or a bit of scholarship you may or may not know, but I've been persuaded, looking at Greek temples and statues and the evolution of the temples and the orders, that rather than the idea of a sort of temple fitting a statue, I think that's a sort of common idea, that in a way you had these massive statues, particularly when you got to the Parthenon and other buildings, and somehow the temple frames that. And that's part of the reason for its size, the great size of these buildings. But actually, there was no congregational need. So the main sort of group activities happened outside around the altar.
Indeed, yeah.
There wasn't an equivalent of Christian sermons or light
Indeed,
that needed people. And you started with your, the little statue, the Zoanna that was, fell from heaven, which is not the only. There were other myths of parallel kind of events that other Greek cities, and sanctuaries evoked. So what I think actually happened was that these statues once upon a time were made of wood, or then the first stone ones came along. They were small, and they were probably up to around a meter or meter and a half tall in general, sometimes even smaller. And then suddenly around the time of coming up to around 600, very notionally, there was like a sort of explosion in statue size, and you got these huge kuroi and things like that. And then statues grew, and actually then temples sort of grew in the same way. They didn't really need this congregation, as I said. And it's votive aspect of temples. I think we all have the idea of a house of a god, but the votive, the dedicatory aspect, which I'm just wanting, sorry, it's taking a rather long time, but to link up with your original notion of redundancy with which you began your talk. It just struck me as something, to reflect on, or we could have a conversation later date, but better at this point, either if you want to reflect on that, or we could have another comment. It wasn't really another question, was it? Mine wasn't really a question, it was just a comment.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating what you say. And indeed, the statue I referred to was apparently described as nothing but, a sort of lump of wood. It was had no great artistic merit. But I think the idea of redundant beauty is one which is incredibly hard to achieve, because buildings are more often than not required to work for their living, so they have to. They have to provide rental, or they have to provide spaces for assembly, etc. So statues occupy real estate. They occupy space where human beings could stand. So it's hard enough, persuading clients to allow statues to be built, because they're occupying the space where a human being might stand and do something. So the miracle really is that in the 21st century, we are still able to achieve these buildings, which, cost a great deal. A huge amount of care goes into the making of them. But they actually deliver the most precious gift of all, which is the sort of gift of art, which is the stilling of the soul, which is the nourishing of the soul. And our great forebears knew of this, but it's something that is quite difficult to achieve in my experience in this day and age.
Well, I think you actually show that it is achievable, and I'm sure it's difficult, but it's obviously not impossible from what we've seen.
It's not impossible.
At this point, let's see what the chats have. Do they have a question?
There aren't any questions at the moment in the chat. I've said anyone's welcome to unmute and ask Craig a question directly if they feel like it.
Yes, let's wait a little bit. And I've of course got lots of questions, but I mean, you won't want to. No one will want to hear any more of those kinds of ones. So. Well, while if no one's going to come up, then I just have to carry on, I suppose, because I would love to, pin, what's the word? Yeah. Just have Craig fly over as a statue and have him fall from heaven right here, and then have a good long conversation. But you mentioned, Craig, in I think particular architects I remember hearing were Schinkel and Pleshnik. And there was also one architect that I don't know actually if it was an architect you mentioned. You talked about someone hovering perpetually over you, and I unfortunately missed that name. Who was that?
Michelangelo.
Ah, right. Okay. No, that's very good triad. And then I imagine there's people like Lutyens who you would be very interested in. You mentioned Tate. But
Yeah,
I having seen the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm recently and the Leverentz Chapel of the Resurrection there,
yeah,
I just wondered, because you
yeah,
have a lot of emphasis on the Danish and I just
yeah.
wondered if you had seen that and what you thought of that, and if that was something, a building that you kind of feel any kindred feeling with, or if maybe Leverentz, because of his subsequent, if you like, moving away from
Yeah.
Classicism, was less of interest to you. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
No, I mean, I know I haven't visited them in person, as it were, but I know them very well from publications, and I'm a great admirer of the early work of Leverentz, indeed. And I mean, he makes reference, actually, a subtle reference to Michelangelo in a very subtle way, and his work is, like Russell Pope, very refined, very restrained, very chaste, very Greek in a way, rather than Roman, and it's immensely elegant. And I struggle with his later work. I can understand how it developed, but I find it what I call very thin gruel. It's not an entire meal for me, and but I deeply respect the work, and I can understand how a classically trained architect had moved in that direction, and there are many of them. Indeed, Mies van der Rohe had a very good classical background, and produced some chaste, very good Schinkel-like buildings, and they all come out of the Greek and they come out of the Greek and German tradition, which is very closely allied, and of course also with the Danish. But the Danish is interesting because of their sort of celebration of Herculaneum and Pompeii. And what's particularly attractive about the Danish contribution is the fact that the embracing of all of the arts. What I was trying to demonstrate was that these were artists, painters, furniture makers, furniture designers, Hermann Ernest Freund, who we spoke about, designed everything, all the clothes that he wore. He took his children to school in a beautiful decorated little carriage that he made, hand-drawn, with painted Greek-like vase decorations on it, and managed to transform the whole of Denmark, really, into a sort of Pompeii of the North at the time. And it's a sort of movement that people don't know, very much about, but it's fascinating, and I think hugely interesting to see how the North borrows from the South, the hot South borrows from the North. And behind me, I don't know if people can see, there's a vase which has on the one side an allegory of the North, taking from the South, in other words, the modern classical world taking from the ancient world what it needs to develop. And then on the other side of the vase is the opposite, and so it's this continual exchange between the North and the South, the Antiquity and modern classicism. And you realize, actually, in the end, that it's not a linear thing. It's a sort of circular thing. And those are the kind of layers of interaction between the past and the North and the South that interest me and permeate the work that I try and do.
Great, and thank you for that. And so now, on you mentioned with the vase, I think I heard, what you need to develop, or what was needed to develop. And there's actually a question here that I think is sort of taking and moving in that kind of talking to that theme. And perhaps it's actually, I don't know who wrote that, but it's from Stanhope Gate. So someone there, can you elaborate on the mode of construction? Oh, no. Sorry. It's Thomas Secular, I think, that's the question I wanted.
Thomas worked Hello, Thomas.
Craig. Right. Greetings. Well, does Thomas want to turn on unmute and actually say the question as opposed to me trying to do so?
Hi, Craig. Can you hear me?
I can, Thomas. So nice to hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you. And it's very, very nice to hear you.
Hi, it's a wonderful lecture, Craig. It's really great to see your work again. I was just wondering, I did some teaching with the ICAA America this weekend, and I was kind of just exposed to some of the young students in America who don't have or haven't had a chance to really explore traditional architecture given the situation of the education program here. And so I was wondering if you might just kind of speak on what advice you might give to young architects who are just entering into practice and maybe didn't have education in the great work of classicism.
Well, that's a very good question. And by the way, Thomas is one of the future generation of classical architects that everybody should keep an eye on. A wonderfully talented young man. But a very, very good question, Thomas, because, you know, a lot of my generation were what I suppose was self-taught and have had to learn not through a formal training, but learn through what I think is probably extremely valuable. I mean, many ways of getting the knowledge that is required to be a classical architect. But the best way, really, in my opinion, is to just get out and look at great buildings and absorb as much as you possibly, literally devour every last building, and not to be in any way, if you can help it as a young architect, not to be prejudiced against one form of classical architecture or another. Try to be like an open flower, ready to be pollinated by any form, whether it's the Greek or the Roman or Hellenistic or the wonderful early 20th century classical architecture, both in Europe and in America. The tradition in America is vast and magnificent. And so my advice really is to have a sketchbook and to draw endlessly and look and not be persuaded by anybody other than yourself of what is good and what you should look at and what you shouldn't look at. But it does mean it's hard work. It means, you know, a lot of looking and drawing and measuring, and but it's huge fun because I always say one is amongst friends, because you walk around a street corner in Venice and you bump into Sansovino or Palladio and you recognize them immediately. And it's you know, you have this wonderful repository of ideas from dead architects who've gifted us material that we can all rely on, and then we have a duty to take that knowledge and do something interesting with it that does justice and to the great architects of the past. So there are wonderful programs in America and in the UK, and increasingly more schools are offering classical architecture. But I still think that real knowledge is quite hard won, and one needs to get out there with a rucksack on your back, sketch pad in the back of that rucksack, and look hard and read and experience it, and then a total immersion is what's required, I think, and it's such a joy. It's not really hard work. So that would be my rather long-winded advice.
Those are very inspiring words. Thank you, Craig, for everything you do.
Thanks so much.
And thank you, Craig, for that. And there is, if I can make a link, if I can jump over one question to George Samara Smith, because that's actually a continuation of the same question. We can go back to the previous one after this.
Okay.
But can you say something a little bit more specific, perhaps, about programs you've been involved in? I don't know if you want to give any recommendations to potential students, or if you just want to comment more generally.
Well, of course, I mean, I've been privileged to work at Kingston, to help at Kingston on and off, and I'm such an admirer of everything they've done there against all the odds, and you know, several generations of young UK architects have passed through that school. And then, of course, Notre Dame, both in the States, in Indiana and in Rome. But Washington now, and you know, Europe is badly served, I think. But I'm really not an expert. But you know, the summer schools are so important as well. But I still think that what is important is this idea of students being exposed to the vast range of classical ideas that are out there, and not to be sort of cornered into one particular way of making exposure to the widest range of classical architecture. I think will give each student an opportunity to select what they feel most comfortable with. It's only after, you know, doing a lot of designing and making that one comes to realize what one feels instinctively most comfortable with. And it might not be where you thought you'd end up. You know, that's the thing. You have to, that's the mysterious thing about art and architecture. You have to sort of follow your instincts, and see where it, and then be brave sometimes, you know. But it, you know, since I started with no formal classical training, other than a very, very good mentors. I've had two great mentors in my life, and they, you know, hugely important, and very good grounding in history of architecture, which is also critical.
Right. No, thank you. And have you got the stomach for any more?
Yes.
Craig, yeah. If you're quite happy,
yeah, I'm quite happy if everybody else is bored of me.
Flipping through the you know, the line of chats, and here is one about construction. So this is one from Stanhope Gate, or I assume someone there, an individual. Can you elaborate on the mode of construction of the masonry building and materials used, particularly in the American context?
Yeah, I mean, on the projects that we've realized in Dallas, they have been much like the construction of the early structures in 20th century in America. They're frame based, and that allows a lot of window space, and then the external skin of handmade brick and stone is tied, and all of the overhanging projections, the cornices, are tied back to the frame. It's different from the way, you know, it's not solid load bearing construction, but we're dealing with buildings of extreme height, and the Americans, of course, perfected that technique, and were able to build very, very quickly as a result. As I said, the first project we did in Dallas was a steel frame, and the second was a concrete frame, the 240-foot bell tower, and the city block we're doing now is a steel frame clad in Indiana limestone and handmade brick as well. Right.
And presumably, is it right to think you work with executive architects there? That
yes, we have a wonderful relationship with a firm of architects who are not, you know, classically trained architects, and who are delightful to work with because they're so respectful of us as designers. They are you know, really enjoying the process of learning the language through us, and we've worked with them for so long now that, you know, a lot of them are very well versed now in the language, and I just so admire in America the lack of prejudice. there's just absolutely no problem for them to work with us, even though they're not, not classical architects. They relished the idea of working with us and understanding, a different tradition, really. So that's been really humbling for us, I have to say.
Great. No, that's very good to hear. And then there is, I think, we're going, obviously, since Sandy's statues work, I should say, work more generally, because it was lovely to see those painted works and bronze works and reliefs and all of that.
Yes.
Here's a question. Perhaps Alexander would like to unmute and deliver your question directly.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your talk, Craig. It was really interesting.
Alex, pleased that you could listen.
No, it was really good. I'm so glad that I got to hear you, because it's always good to see your work, and it was just honestly so good. I'm just interested, when you are designing your buildings, how collaborative the process is with Sandy. Does it sometimes happen that Sandy has an idea for a sculptor and that informs your architecture, or is it very much you commissioning him to design a sculpture for your space? I'm just that process.
That's a very good question, Alex. And again, Alex is also the future of classical architecture, I have to say. So it's a very, very good question. I can honestly say that on all of the projects that I've shown you, Sandy has been involved from the very outset. I can remember on Cullum Chapel, us both going to the very first interview with the patron. So before any work began at all, we met with the patron, and many of the principal ideas in the designs, particularly of the mausoleums, were driven by tiny little thumbnail sketches exchanged between Sandy and I from the very, very outset. So I have to say that his genius has led these projects, not necessarily in architectural terms, but in the sort of kernel of the idea, and then also we, as traditionalists, we're sort of stylists. We can work in all different styles, and sculptors are the same. Traditional sculptors are the same. They can work in a Beaux-Arts style, or they can work in a chaste Thorvaldsen style, or a Hellenistic style, and so often the project's stylistic treatment comes from the idea of how one might treat how this sculpture might present itself. So it for me, the most rewarding part of the whole process is that one is working in collaboration, proper collaboration. It's not an architect finishing a building and then saying, I've got a niche left over here, or I've got a place in the middle of my courtyard. Would you like to place a sculpture? It's much more. I never would dare to place the sculpture in a courtyard and then tell Sandy where to put it, because it's so much more interesting to find out where the primary view of that statue might be in relationship to the building. So in terms of design, choice of iconography, how that iconography might represent the type of building that you're designing. And I've spoken about the temple of pleasure for the bathhouse. Well, I mean, as classical architects, we're always just rarely designing temples, whether it's a post office or a police station, or we're all just trying to design temples, I think, well, for me. And most temples are dedicated, have a dedicatory dedication. And so I always usually rely on his huge, vast intellect and knowledge to help with the iconography, the sort of narrative, if you like, of the buildings, which will then govern everything from, the appearance of the temple, but also the doorknobs and maybe the fabrics that line the altars. And so I would just simply encourage everybody, if you haven't had the experience of working with, collaboratively in this way, it's the way I believe Christian Daniel Rauch worked with Schinkel. It's the way Lee Lowry worked with Grosvenor Goodhue. You know, there's so many examples, Ictinus and Phidias. And it's just an utter joy, and it's revolutionary for us as architects, because we've always considered ourselves as being sort of grander than everybody else. And it's so, it can take you into such wonderful territory if one can just, you know, listen to a great artist and pay respect to them and welcome them in to the design process, as one should invite, you know, anything really. One needs to be open, because that's the way I think that one can be truly responsive.
Great, thanks very much. That's very interesting, and yeah, no, fantastic to hear the collaborative process. I always think that must be sometimes quite difficult, because, as you said, the architect, I don't know, I think even the idea of God, the architect of the world, has that kind of, you know, connotation as being the sort of creator, and, you know, and I think it's a fantastic, there is that process of collaboration.
No,
yeah, you can definitely see it though, because it fits, you know, the sculptures fit so well within the architecture. It's a you know, it's a fantastic merge. So yeah, thanks very much for answering.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Alexander. And then perhaps finally, there's Ian. Ian, would you like to turn on your unmute and direct your question? I don't know if you've heard. Otherwise, I can. I'll proceed then. So, Craig, this is the last question in the chats.
Yeah.
So, hello, Craig. Like
Yeah.
you, I was very lucky to have two very good classical mentors that brought me into the classical tradition. What was the most memorable lesson you learned from your mentors?
Well, I from my first mentor, which is Professor Barry Bierman in South Africa, I learned the lesson of sketchbooks and looking through your sketchbooks. I learned that. And from my second mentor, Gavin Stamp, I learned the lesson of getting rid of all one's childish prejudices and looking at architecture for the sake of good architecture, and not being childish and ignoring certain aspects of architecture or certain styles or certain periods, but trying to be as open as possible. And I'm deeply indebted to both of them, really, for all of that.
Right. Well, thank you. And I think that would join us up with what you were saying earlier about the being opening like a flower, being ready to be pollinated. So that was Gavin, perhaps,
Yes,
in the direction of that lovely thought. Well, I think it's just about a half an hour gone of questions. We're 8:30. We don't usually run this late, Craig. And I think
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. I mean it as a sort of compliment or an endorsement, because obviously there are you know, people here who are hanging on, and they're not leaving, and they're in fact, we have just one last question, maybe.
Sure.
PBS. Oh, is that yes? And this is interesting because it comes from a sculptor with an aspiration to architecture. So Jack, would you like to unmute? And then I think we should make this our last question, just
Okay.
time and people's stomachs rumbling and whatever. So Jack, if you can hear and you can unmute, then you please ask your question.
Hello, I don't know if you can hear me. It was more
Yes.
just a comment. I'm a great admirer of your work, and
Thank you.
yeah, it's just Yeah, I'm a sculptor, and I've been on a few programs in classical architecture, and I've always felt a strong pull in both directions. And I see, yeah, yeah, it was just more of a comment just to say that thank you for your work that truly brings it together in one composition. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jack. I mean, I would just encourage you, you know, we're so short on sculptors who are prepared to work in this collaborative way. Part of the sort of, one of the problems with the so-called modern movement is that sculptors have isolated themselves into a sort of sacred world of their own, away from the architect. It began with, you know, Henry Moore refusing to, or being very reluctant to work on Holden's 55 Broadway in London. So it's just so encouraging that architects, that sculptors as well, young sculptors are willing to, you know, engage with architects. It has to be both directions, young architects and young sculptors. And old architects and old sculptors need to join forces. So I would just be encouraging you and so many others.
Yeah, well, I'm very open to any projects anyone has.
Good.
Oh, sorry, I was saying something then, but I hadn't unmuted. So, Jack, I was just saying that your inbox will be inundated tomorrow with requests. So I think we should wind up, and all of us, you know, thank Craig immensely for what has been a truly insightful and rewarding and really quite special talk. So thank you very much, Craig.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.